Greetings, I'm Joyce Simons Murphy, and I'm here to show you today how to draft a pocket pattern for pants. I don't know about you, but I couldn't manage without pockets. Making a pocket pattern is a fun thing to do. Enjoy! Now we're ready to do the pocket. All of the design information needed is right here on the front. So the first pattern piece I'm going to make is the pocket pattern piece. And I've laid a piece of clean tissue over the top that is long enough and wide enough to cover those design lines. And I'm going to weight it down so that it won't move, and then I'm going to trace some lines. So I'm going to trace the pocket bag. And I can do that fairly quickly. It's not critical where exactly it goes, so I'm not bothering to use a ruler. I am going to use a ruler here because it's a little easier just to draw that straight line quickly up through the waist. And that's the pocket bag. Now the other thing we're going to need on the pocket piece, and I'll go ahead and label this pocket, and our pocket piece is going to use the side seam. So let's take a curved ruler and we'll copy the side seam onto the pocket pattern. And I want to get this curve as close to what it is here originally as I possibly can, because it is what fit and I don't want to ruin the fit. And I'm going to take that down far enough to come to the end of the pocket bag. Okay, so there's the side seam, and then I'll do the waist segment that goes from the side seam over to just past the stitching line for the pocket bag. And there's the waistline for the pocket piece and the side seam. And we're going to need to know where this slant line is. I'm not going to use it in my pocket piece. I'm not going to cut there. But I am going to use it to line up the pocket facing, the faced front is going to line up to this line. So I'm going to say line up here, and I'm going to put arrows down to it, and I'm going to trace it. And I'm going to use my curve to trace it because I don't want it to come out perfectly straight. I want that little bit of a curve in the edge because it looks so much better. So it can be done with a solid line or a dashed, it wouldn't matter. But you just want to have that. You'll want to have that line on there. Okay. And then that's the point that is going to get squared out here. And I see the notch that sits underneath is at 5/8, and I've got a 1-inch seam allowance on here. So I'm just going to draw this right straight out 1 inch, just so I have that mark on here, because it is going to be a notch right here, and I'm going to use that notch to match up with the faced front, and I'm going to use this notch up here to match up, to help line up that pocket. And this one, I'm going to mark this with an X so that I'm aware of exactly where that point is. Okay, so that's all the critical information that I need on the pocket. And now the pocket facing can be developed right off the pocket pattern piece. So to do the facing, I'm going to lay a blank sheet of the pattern tissue over the top of the pocket and make sure that it's long enough and wide enough to cover the pocket. And then I'm going to either cut along some lines or trace them. And where the pocket and pocket facing are different, and I'll write on here pocket facing, where they are different is along that slant line. So the pocket facing piece has a 1/4 inch seam allowance added to this line up here line. That ends up being the stitching line on the pocket facing piece. So I'll go ahead and trace off the stitching lines that will be on the pocket facing. They'll be the same as on the pocket for the pocket bag. That's identical. And then up this little segment right here of the side seam, they'll be the same. And then the stitching line for the pocket facing is going to run on up the line up here line on the pocket, because that's what we're lining up, is the facing to the pocket along this line. So we'll trace that part of it. And then we'll trace this part. And that is the stitching line on the facing. And then this little bit of the waistline also is a part of the facing pattern piece. So that's our pocket facing. I think I got it all here. Let's see, when we pick it up, we'll find out. Yes, I think that looks good. So I'll label this the stitching line. And that's the stitching line right there. And then I'm going to add a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the stitching line so that you don't have to trim that away. It has the curve to it, and you don't need a big seam allowance in there. So the 1/4 inch works good. So take that all the way up to the waist. And then put your 1/2 inch seam allowance on at the waist. And put a 1 inch seam allowance out here. So the pocket facing gets sewn to the front at a 1/4 inch along this slanted line. Facing and front are cut identical. And then when you get down to this side seam, then you go out perpendicular to the side seam directly to the cut edge. So this is your 1 inch seam allowance. So that way, when you're stitching, this is your pivot point. So you're stitching down here like this. You get to the pivot point and you pivot right at this point and head directly to the raw edge on the side. And then when you clip to the pivot point, you can open up the seam. And then if you had to let this out, you have a finished seam here in a nice little corner. So that's why it's engineered this way. And then we'll put a 1/2 inch seam allowance up here, and then a clip line here to this point, to the pivot point. So here I am holding the ruler up next to the stitching line, and the line above that you see right here is the 1/2 inch seam allowance that it's applied to this line. So this will be your cutting line on the facing. So here I am drawing the line for the place to clip, and then we'll label it clip. Or the finished edge that's going to match up to where those notches are. So I have my seam allowances drawn on the pocket facing, the 1/4 inch here, the 1/2 inch there, and the 1/2 inch there. And then I can cut the seam allowance off of both the pocket and the pocket facing together, and that'll be at 5/8. Okay, so let's put our seam allowance on the pocket. All right, there's an inch seam allowance out the side on the pocket. And here's the 1/2 across the top. And I already trimmed this a little bit, it looks like, but I think I've got enough there. So then you can trim this off. Well, let's put the 2 pieces together and cut them as one, might as well. And we can mark that 1/2 inch pocket bag or take a stab at it because it's not critical that it's exactly 5/8. Okay, so I'm going to pin these together so I can cut them together. I'm matching up my lines. Okay, so here at the pocket bag, let's just guess at 5/8. And the important thing is that they're cut similar, the pocket and the pocket facing, because that's what you're going to sew together. They don't have to be exactly the right depth or exactly the same depth of pocket as you had on your pattern. It's not a critical design point. Okay, so I'll finish trimming this out. And pattern making can be fun when you give yourself license to just kind of cut where you want to cut, when that is possible without making any problems for yourself. Okay, so that's the pocket and the pocket facing that are bagged together. And I could cut one more thing together here, although it's pretty well marked. I can go across this waistline piece because that matches up on the pocket and the pocket facing. Okay, so then let's take a look and see how we're doing here. We've just about got things wrapped up with the pocket and the pocket facing. So I'll cut this on the cutting line here to finish out the pocket. So there's the pocket. And the pocket facing, we might as well cut that out so we can see what we have. And that's a 1/4 inch there. And a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. And the 1 inch seam allowance here. Okay. So I think we're looking pretty good here. So the facing will get attached to the front, and the pocket will be next to the body, and this will be cut on. Has 1 inch here, a 1/2 inch here, and approximately 5/8 around here. And this will line up here. And when this is stitched to the front and finished off, that's where your hand will go. So that's your pocket.